What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you 5 reasons to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. And if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it as well. But with all that being said, let's get started. So my first reason to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022 is the wireless charging. Now, this feature isn't really a game changer by any means, but it is a really cool feature for an entry-level phone to have. Even though it's really not very complicated of a feature, especially in 2022, for some reason, not a whole lot of phones that aren't flagship phones seem to have it. Even when you get into the upper mid-range, phones like the Samsung Galaxy A52 5G, for example, the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G, and some of the nicer OnePlus phones, for whatever reason, just don't seem to have it. But this phone, even as a really entry-level phone going for only $100 as of the recording of this video, actually does have 10-watt wireless charging. Now, the reason wireless charging is nice is because, first of all, the obvious benefit is wireless charging is just more convenient than plugging it in. You can simply put it down on the charger and just pick it up instead of having to unplug it. Now, of course, that's not really a game changer since plugging in a phone and unplugging it really isn't that hard, but it's still a nice thing to have. The second benefit of wireless charging is, say your charging port breaks, which it does happen under normal circumstances. With a phone like this that's super entry level, it's probably not going to be worth the money and trouble to fix it. So without wireless charging, you would normally just have to get rid of the phone and get a new one. But with wireless charging, if your charging port breaks, you can still use a wireless charger and keep the phone alive for a little bit longer. And that is a nice thing because these phones do have a good amount of longevity. So if you didn't have any data transfer to do, even if your charging port breaks with this phone, you could still potentially get another year or two out of it. So overall, wireless charging is a nice feature to have, especially in entry-level phones. And since the vast majority of phones that aren't flagship phones don't have it, it is nice to see that a phone like this does. My second reason to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022 is the large display. Now, this phone has a 6.52-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So in and of itself, the display isn't amazing. It doesn't have a super high resolution, although the picture does look decently sharp for what it is. The colors aren't really the brightest or boldest. It's of course not going to be anything close to one of the higher end mid-range phones that have AMOLED displays or anything like that. And the viewing angles, as you can see, aren't really the greatest either. But the display is definitely on the larger side, and that's going to be great for general content consumption. So if you're streaming videos, reading, viewing photos, that sort of stuff, things are still going to show up decently large on this display, so it's still going to give you a nice experience. Now, another thing that adds to this is that we get a nice tall and narrow form factor here, so more stuff is going to fit on the screen when you're reading, meaning you won't have to scroll as much, and when you're watching videos in landscape mode, it's going to have a nice cinematic appearance. In addition to this, at 6.52 inches, while this is pretty average, again, it's still going to be a decently large size for all your content consumption needs, but at the same time, it's not going to be too large for the phone to be comfortable to hold in your hand or carry in your pocket. So overall, I do think 6.52 inches is a great size for the display of a phone like this. My third reason to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022 is because it has an ultra-wide camera. Now, to give you a quick rundown of the camera setup here, we got an 8 megapixel front-facing camera and a water drop notch up here. And then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode. Now, overall, for what it is, this camera setup is actually pretty good, and I am impressed with how good the pictures are. So when it comes to the ultra-wide camera, while an ultra-wide camera is definitely not a unique feature by any means, there are lots of phones in this price range, and actually even more expensive than this, that don't have one. In fact, a perfect example of this is the Motorola Moto G Power 2022 that just recently came out. That phone is almost double the price of this one, and it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. Now, one thing that I have noticed is that lots of phones in this price range, if they don't have an ultra-wide camera, end up having macro cameras, but I personally think an ultra-wide camera is a lot more useful for the average user because a macro camera is a more niche feature that only really has the one purpose of getting close-up detailed photos. Otherwise, if you're not trying to do that, it's really going to be of no use to you. Whereas with an ultra-wide camera, there are lots of other situations where it would make sense to have one. For example, if you're taking a group photo, maybe you want to get a photo of a building or a large object, or maybe a room or some scenery or something like that. The list really goes on. There's so many different uses for an ultra-wide camera, whereas a macro camera, that's a lot more common on phones in this price range, really isn't nearly as useful. So although this phone doesn't have the camera quality of a phone much more expensive than it, the photos are in general pretty good, and I'm definitely glad that this phone does have an ultra-wide camera. My fourth reason to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022 is the battery. So with this phone, we're getting a 4,000 milliamp hour battery that supports 10 watt fast charging. Now, this technically isn't the largest battery you can get, and if the battery is your number one concern, then you can actually even do better than this phone, since there are plenty of entry-level phones that have 5,000 milliamp hour batteries. But for the average user, if you care about battery life, but it's not your main priority, the battery on this phone is actually going to be pretty good. At 4,000 milliamp hours, that's not small by any means, and you're going to get plenty of battery life throughout the day, in fact, probably more than you need. And that also means that as the battery degrades over time, since you're already going to start with more battery life than you need, as the battery starts to get older and lose capacity, you're not going to notice it nearly as quickly as you would with a smaller battery, like say an iPhone's battery. And of course, in addition to this, again, the wireless charging is nice, and it also supports 10 watt fast charging. So if you're in a situation where your phone is dying and you don't have a whole lot of time to charge it up, the fast charging will definitely come in handy there. My fifth reason to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022 is the design. Now, technically, this design isn't really that different from a lot of other phones in this price range. In fact, I can name several phones that look almost identical to this. Like, for example, the T-Mobile Revel phones. I do think this phone looks almost exactly like the T-Mobile Revel 4, I think it is. But that definitely doesn't mean it's a bad design. I do think it looks pretty decent. The bezels aren't too thick. Even the bottom bezel right here that tends to be quite a bit bigger than the rest. And even the water drop notch up here doesn't really even look bad. The phone has a decently slim design. It's not the sleekest thing out there, but it's definitely acceptable, so it's not going to be super bulky in your pocket. And probably my favorite thing about this phone's design is that it has a lot of weight to it, which gives it a much more high quality, kind of premium type of feel. The buttons also feel pretty well built, which is another thing I notice in lower end phones. Typically lower end phones tend to have flimsy buttons, but with this phone, they're really solid and strong. There's also a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key, which is one of my favorite spots for a fingerprint scanner. And all in all, I do think this design is really nice if you're looking for something with some quality to it. And all in all, I do think this design is really nice, especially if you're looking for something with some quality to it. Obviously, this phone isn't going to feel like a high-end flagship phone by any means, but for what it is, it does feel really well built. But those were 5 reasons to buy the Visible Midnight in 2022. Overall, there are definitely more than 5 reasons to buy this phone, as well as some shortcomings as well. So if you want to learn more about all that, be sure to check out my full review of the phone as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And as always, I will see you in the next one.